USA, Canada. Is there really a difference between these two North American countries? We'll let you know today in this video.
subscribe ให้พวกเราด้วยนะคะ
Sani Cap, welcome to Tishi Delco. Today, like we said, we're going to be talking about the differences or similarities between the United States of America and Canada. Before we get into that, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more content from us. So the United States and Canada are neighboring countries in North America, and a lot of people from the outside think they're pretty much the same country. And you know what? Growing up in Canada pretty much all my life, some of that is true. And I think mostly because it's our number one thing we're talking about today is really the culture. A lot of Canadian things that we do for entertainment, for food, etc., we share with those living in the United States. Both countries are full of immigrants from many cultures, so we have foods from all over the world. Depending on how large the city is, you can pretty much get food from every culture across the world. The movies we go to, just like a lot of the world, are Hollywood American movies. They tend to be in the same style as Canadian movies. You know, that cultural influence, our cuisines, and the fact that we are both countries full of immigrants make us pretty similar in terms of what we enjoy for entertainment, what we eat, and really also the sports we play and watch are largely Canadian, participating in the large professional American leagues. So I think for a lot on the surface, Canada and the United States might seem the same. So while there are cultural similarities, we are going to walk you through some of the key differences between Canada and the United States and some other similarities as well. So probably the biggest difference between Canada and the United States is just the sizes of the country themselves, both in population and physical land size, but then also government and how the countries themselves are set up. So in terms of population, the United States is far larger than Canada. We mentioned in a previous video that the state of California alone has almost as many people as all of Canada. It's interesting because the United States is a lot more dense, meaning it's a smaller country by land size, but far, far more people, whereas Canada is the second biggest country in the world by land size, but very few people relative to its size. Another big part about how the countries are different and set up is Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories, and the United States is set up into 50 states. And really these are just divisions of land and more local government. But the biggest difference with that is if you're living in the United States, the state governments for each state individually have a lot more power over what happens in those particular states. So that means if you're living in Florida versus Washington state, the policies and certain laws within the states could be very, very different. Whereas in Canada, there are still differences province to province, but the federal government has a lot more say, so therefore laws and customs and different things like these policies are more similar across the country. Generally, our provinces do have power over the education system in the province, healthcare, but for the most part, U.S. states have more individual power than Canadian provinces. So you'll find more differences state to state. And last but not least, in terms of government and setup, is really just elections and who runs the country. So in the United States, you have a president, and generally it's a two-party system, Democrats and Republicans. And when Americans go to vote, they vote for the president. The options is the candidate for president, the names are on the ballot. However, compared to Canada, we operate a little bit differently here, where we don't necessarily just elect the leader in an election. We elect members of parliament who represent different regions, election regions, when we do go to the polls. So rather than, checking off the prime minister compared to a president, we vote for our member of parliament for our election zone. So how the prime minister is chosen in Canada is the political party with the most elected members of parliament, their leader of that party becomes prime minister. So rather than voting for just one person, we vote for many who make up the party, and the party with the most seats in parliament, their leader becomes prime minister. And in Canada, compared to the US, we have, 3, 4, 5 parties that operate at a federal level. So not just, the two-party system like in the United States. There are a little more options, which, there are goods behind that, some bads behind that, and we won't get into that in this video. But it is quite different in the way the countries are set up, their size and population, and the government structures. So another thing that is very similar between Canada and the United States in terms of structure and content is our education systems. Now, they might be funded and treated very differently between countries, but generally their structure running from, pre-grade school, kindergarten, all the way from grades 1 to 8 and then 9 to 12, for primary and secondary school or elementary and high school. These are very similar between countries, and they're very similar, state to state, province to province. Some have a elementary and then a middle school and then high school, but generally all of them have grades 1 to 12. And not only are the structure the same, but the content Americans learn and Canadians learn is also quite similar as well between country, whether it's, the maths we focus on, the science, reading, writing. Most of the stuff we learn, other than maybe some of the, stories read in class, some might be more Canadian themed, whereas others might be more American. Generally, our subjects are the same, and we have similar content in what we learn throughout school. So another really big difference between Canada and the United States is the cost of living. Now, it does depend on the U.S. state you are living in, but generally speaking, most of the United States, in terms of housing, food, groceries, and even consumer products, is going to be cheaper in the United States than Canada. Things generally a lot more, is produced in the United States in terms of especially food, and it is a major trade partner with many countries around the world. So often the things that they either import or produce themselves and then coming into Canada are cheaper right in the United States. Another big difference in terms of cost of living is just the power of the US dollar versus the Canadian dollar. So generally speaking, the US dollar is a stronger currency than the Canadian dollar. There have been times where, the Canadian dollar and the US dollar are about equal in terms of value. But generally speaking, the US dollar is a stronger currency. And, they're afforded more buying power, especially given that they're producing the goods they consume to a larger degree than Canadians. One thing I will call out in terms of where Canada is cheaper than the US is healthcare. And this is because the Canadian system in terms of healthcare is very different than the US. We've mentioned in previous videos how Canadian healthcare is a publicly funded good, and that what that means is that every Canadian, whether it's permanent resident, temporary worker, or Canadian citizen who is working and paying taxes is funding our healthcare system. And when you go to the hospital or the doctor's office, you have a health card and you're not necessarily paying out of pocket. For most things, you're actually not. Whereas in the US, unless you have, employment insurance, health insurance, or some other form of private insurance in the US, healthcare can be very, very expensive for people to access and pay for. Finally, we thought we'd conclude with my favorite topic on similarity difference between US and Canada. And that's really the English we speak, we write, we hear. This one, I think, is a lot of fun, but also for a newcomer and maybe English not being your first language, might be the most confusing. And the reason for this is that I often give the example that you have the US and you have the UK or England, and Canada is kind of right in the middle. What that means is that often the way we write certain words is more like British English. So for instance, color. Canadians would spell that C-O-L-O-U-R, which is the British spelling, whereas Americans would just spell C-O-L-O-R. So generally speaking, anywhere there's a difference where you could have that O-U-R, Canadians will always have O-U-R. So neighborhood, neighbor, color. These examples will all have the O-U-R, whereas in the United States, it would just be O-R. When we're talking actually about speaking English, Canadian, we have our own slang, but our way of speaking, our phrasing, our slang tends to be very similar to many US states and the American style of English, rather than, British phrasing, British slang. We do have our own unique slang in Canada, but our speaking style and our phrasing is generally more like American English. In terms of languages spoken within each country, Canada, United States, Canada actually has two official languages, so English and French. And, the population of French speakers is generally isolated to provinces like Quebec, New Brunswick, but, French will be spoken across the country. And even when you're shopping in grocery stores, the labels on all Canadian things sold here are going to be both in English and French. So we have those two official languages. Whereas in the US, they do just have one official language, being English, but the second most popular language to be spoken there would be Spanish. And this is because they share a huge land border with, Mexico and many countries around Florida in the Caribbean are also Spanish-speaking countries. So they have far more immigrants from Spanish-speaking, Central America, Mexico, and South America. And finally, with language, I'm not going to go into the specifics today, but there are many accents in English, both different Canadian accents, region to region in Canada, and a lot more US or American English accents depending on where you are in the United States. And I will say that most of the Canadian accents for English are very, very different than a lot of the American English accents. So this is another thing where, we both speak the same common language, but it can be very, very different depending on where in the countries you are and who you're speaking with. So these are some quick fun things we thought we'd point out between the differences between Canada and the United States. We really hope you enjoyed these similarities and differences between Canada and the US. If you have any questions or want to comment on any other differences or similarities you've noticed, please feel free to let us know in the comments. We really want to thank you for your support. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video to anyone interested. Thanks again for watching. Sadi Kap. See you next video.